What's going on, guys? This is Empty Box, and let's talk about Geoff Crammond's Grand Prix as a series and the masterpiece that is Grand Prix 4. As I like to start off these videos, let's go ahead and start with a little bit of backstory. So first off, this guy, Geoff Crammond. Well, first of all, this isn't a biography video, that's not the point of this, but he's one of sim racing's important figures, especially in the early year, basically being there when sim racing was created. So I want to make sure that you appreciate the legend with his name on the box, because when we talk about Grand Prix 4, in some ways, we're talking about a guy's work for 20 years, what he did for the best part of his working career, and you will see things that are carried through to the end of the series from the start. The story here begins in 1985, where he had developed a game called Revs on the BBC Micro and later the Commodore 64. I have no idea how in the world people played this back in the day, but they did. I didn't, so I'm sorry for the terrible driving. It's naturally a bit rudimentary, to put it kindly, by today's standards, but it had real-world tracks, driving physics that definitely would have passed on the simulation side of things back in the day, setup adjustment in the form of wing settings. You could see the framework was there. Now, you would think that with the idea of a racing sim, Geoff must have been like some sort of, racing guy, one of us who really likes motorsport. And actually that wasn't the case. The backstory on this game, and therefore the roots of sim racing as a genre as a whole, is as simple as the publisher was sponsoring David Hunt's Formula 3 car at the time, so they thought a game tie-in would be cool, and therefore Geoff Crammond ended up developing Revs. But apparently the idea kind of stuck in his head or something, because in 1989 Geoff would pop up again in the racing world with Stunt Car Racer, this time with 3D and polygons, jumps and all. It seems a bit left field given the games he would end up becoming known for later in the series that we're going to be talking about later on in this video. But apparently, again, he wasn't really a racing guy, so therefore this kind of makes sense in the grand context of things. The whole racing thing was just a interesting, fun way to develop stuff. It was a good challenge, apparently. But someone would get through to him. Someone in this case likely being Microprose and a paycheck. 1992 would see the release of the first title in the Grand Prix series, known as Microprose's F1 Grand Prix, which interestingly is not an F1 licensed game, but it isn't. It's from that good old times of the Wild West of sports licensing where everything is made up and nothing matters, so have at it. This is really where you see the previous two titles merge into one thing and what the Grand Prix series would become. You see the idea of a game like Revs and trying to make the cars behave in a more realistic fashion and more grounded in reality to what the cars actually are. You see a game like Stunt Car Racer reflected in 3D and polygons and having physics and all that stuff, and expanding that into something interesting enough to be a commercial hit in the form of, well, let's make an F1 racing game. You add it all together, and it's not hard to see how impactful this game would have been back in its day, being one of, if not the first racing sims to feature a full real-world series, even if it is kind of a bit vaguely fictionalized. Like in 1992, this game would have stood out as distinctly different, and that's why there's still a following around this game to this day that will insist that this is one of the best, if not the best, F1 games ever released. Today, though, I think the original gets massively overshadowed by the surprisingly unoriginally named follow-up 4 years down the road in 1996, Grand Prix 2. This time Grand Prix was back, but this time actually featuring an official F1 license and the full 1994 season. Similar to the original, this one would go down in history as a smashing success, and I'm pretty positive there will again be plenty of people in the comment section down below raving about how this game was better than sliced bread or whatever other thing is amazingly great in your own regional dialect. Honestly, I feel like I'm underselling this game a bit, so all I can say is this is one of those games that holds up surprisingly well. Not a lot of racing sims, in my opinion, from the 90s and the early 2000s in stock format ever hold up well, because it was just an era where things and hardware and all that stuff, it was just, there was only so much possible. But playing this game today, much like the original F1 Grand Prix, is still just fun, and it's easy to understand why these games were such massive successes and having a more widespread appeal as well as a more hardcore appeal. 4 years later once more, and it's time for Grand Prix 3 to finally come out in the year 2000. The major addition to the series this time around would be the addition of rain. And even today, there is plenty of love for those first 2 Grand Prix games and the 4th one, but the 3rd one, at least from what I've always perceived, just kind of exists. It's a game that is adequate, but hardly the impactful games that the first 2 were. Eventually, Grand Prix 3 would get an expansion in 2001, this time adding the 2000 F1 season. And interestingly, there was supposed to be a Sega Dreamcast release, because for some reason the Sega Dreamcast keeps coming up in all these videos that I'm doing, but that never happened. Honestly, I've not spent near enough time with Grand Prix 3 to say definitely, but I think that it's safe to say this one just kind of fell flat and lost out going toe-to-toe with the then brand spanking new EA F1 series. On PC, EA's F1 games were squarely aimed at outdoing this franchise, and in many ways did. Comparatively, Grand Prix 3 still featured one car shape for all cars on the grid, less advanced physics, worse graphics, released later, and featured a season 2 years out of date. It just was outdone and it lost. That leads us to what would become the end of the road for the Grand Prix series in the suitably named Grand Prix 4, which would release in 2002, featuring the 2001 Formula 1 season. As you can probably guess by the time frame between releases, this game was somewhat shoved out the door. For one, the marketplace competition with EA's F1 games. For two, Microprose as a publisher was sadly well and truly on their deathbed about 5 times over by this point, and Infogrames was just throwing money at problems. And lastly, Grand Prix's Formula 1 license was expiring. The Formula 1 license was up for grabs, which, if you're broke, you know you aren't going to outbid EA. And, well, surprisingly, actually, EA isn't fully the bad guy here for once, because it would turn out that no one would outbid Sony for an exclusive Formula 1 license for 2003 onwards. There was supposed to be a original Xbox console version of this game, which was planned, and I think there was like one preview out there, though it was never released and always seemed like it's just much more of a "we need money, please" show pony more than anything. Shortly and abruptly after release, the plug was pulled, and that was that. The Grand Prix series had run its course and hasn't shown any signs of life since. And with that, Geoff Crammond disappeared into the wilderness to go chill with Bigfoot, never to be seen again like the true hero that he is. Embellishing a bit, but I think for those of us who are fans, we like to prefer to think about it that way because it's just more interesting and fun. The actual reality is much less exciting. He's just kind of gone and done various projects outside of sim racing land here and there, and does as he sees fit. That said, I will say, one dreams that with the Microprose name making a comeback lately with all these little goofy indie titles that keep coming out that bring back that nostalgia, someone gets through to Geoff and they get the band back together, because sim racing desperately needs Grand Prix 5 with the way things are today. So with that, let's go ahead and take a look at that parting shot for this series, Grand Prix 4. This game shows its dated platform. And I don't mean that as in I'm playing a game from 2002 here in 2023. I mean that in a we had problems with this even way back when kind of way. Control binding was and is a mess. This game will only support 2 input devices, which wasn't uncommon or unreasonable back then at the time, but getting your sensitivity settings and steering assist and all that jazz dialed in is just a hoop to jump through, even if you're using a wheel. There's also an issue myself and others used to have where the pedals would always register as active, causing the selected item or selected menu item to scroll like endlessly, which rendered the game sort of more or less unplayable. Oddly, there's some options that you'd expect that are just totally absent, such as the ability to change the race length in the quick race mode, which means that you have to do a full race weekend if you want to have any race longer than 3 laps. There's also a lack of substantial control over the weather settings, which we'll talk about that a little bit later on why that is. One of the most annoying features of this game, and again a wow this is old feature, is changing the car setup leads to needing to reload the car and track when you exit the garage and come back to the track, which back in the day with a much slower system was a total pain in the backside. Especially once you start adding mods, even on a modern system, it still renders tweaking the setup a long, slow, painful slog because of the way the game was built. It's just not a good system, but that's the way it was because that's the way it had been. Frame rate doesn't really matter here. Instead, it's processor occupancy, where if you overload the processor and try and make the game run too hard on your system, essentially the game goes into slow motion because it's all tied and like thing is built on spaghetti code and it can't deviate from where it was, which meant that online racing was never going to be a thing with the Grand Prix series because you can't have cars that are in slow motion essentially while other cars are in real time. It would break the whole thing. This game also commits the gaming sin of removing control from the player, which here it manifests itself in the inability to fully control the car into, through, and exiting the pits. There's always like a stability control applied there, and an automatic pit speed limiter is baked in. Like, this game very much has roots in the 1980s and the early 90s, and it often shows. The driving physics were another hotly debated thing back in the day where this game sort of shows its age. Now, for reference, I'm playing with a wheel and have only played this game with a wheel because I've always had a wheel since I've had this game. This game has physics that you either love because it's actually fairly realistic, but not mind-numbingly so, or they felt horribly dated even on release. It's very much a love it or leave it type of experience. There are numerous major issues and limitations, such as all cars share the exact same physics by default, which means that a Minardi and a Ferrari are exactly the same. Similarly, there's no difference at all between a Bridgestone and Michelin-tired car. There are no tire or brake temps, no dirty air, nor some of the more modern features like flat spotting or track rubbering, of course. This is very dated and even was on release from a simulation standpoint, just on basic concepts alone. Now, fortunately, with one of those, the whole thing with the Minardi and a Ferrari being exactly the same, GPX patch, which is a must-have community patch, it's been around since basically the start, sort of fixes that issue by adjusting the car power and grip on a per-team basis, but by default, that's the way it works, and it's a big miss. But you should never play Grand Prix 4 just stock. You should always 100% have GPX patch, but we'll talk about that later. The cars, in terms of driving, also feel like they're very railroady, if it makes any sense. They feel like they are superglued to the ground with the strongest adhesive that 3M could possibly devise. While many will just go ahead and say, duh, downforce, it really feels way more akin to baked-in stability control more than anything, even with all the assists turned off, and when you think about the whole pit lane system and all that stuff, like, it just gets the feeling that you're just kind of along for the ride at times and it's going to do what it's decided that it wants to do. That said, I wouldn't even call this a simcade. I would still say this is still a sim racing game. Running without traction control will keep you awake on the throttle pedal coming out of the slower corners. You're not going to save it all that often in this game because when it breaks loose, it breaks loose. Cars are very pointy and snappy, which is what you'd expect for cars of this age, and it's what you see in plenty of other racing sims that we all know and love for these types of cars. Curbing is to be carefully considered, as if you take the wrong curb, it will end you in an instant. One thing particularly noteworthy, and basically the exact opposite of every other racing sim out there on the market at the time, the physics had no problem attacking corners and really driving aggressively, besides the fact that the cars will bite very quickly. You know, especially the lower speed corners, those were areas where every other racing sim at the time had as some of the diciest corners around, whereas here in GP4 you can absolutely charge the corner as you would expect. Really, the physics are one of the biggest shockers for me coming back to this game after probably like a decade away from it. I knew to expect a dated experience because I know it is a dated experience from the core issues that trace back to the days of MS-DOS. However, I actually find the physics and driving experience to have aged way better than I would have thought, and certainly much better than most other racing sims from this era. Even the force feedback surprised me and felt like a glove after all these years. When considered as part of the whole package, the physics and the driving experience isn't what I'm going to play Grand Prix 4 for, but it gets the job done and it works really well, to the point where I actually end up sweating profusely playing this game because I end up spending that much time in like deep mental concentration mode where I can't even talk, which is, if you've ever watched one of my videos, I can drive plenty of cars driving while talking, but Grand Prix 4, like when I'm driving, it's just like, nope, silence. Every lap is a qualifying lap, keeping it on the edge and just driving with the aggression that you can in this game, which it just fits the whole experience so well, even if it is kind of a little bit weird and in many ways is certainly very dated. Turns out maybe thermonuclear tire models actually aren't everything. So far in this video, I've painted Grand Prix 4 as a dated, kind of middling platform even in its day. Now I'll be talking about how this game feels like it's 20 years in the future from today's titles. If you've ever watched one of my videos where I've lamented the death of racing against AI that is actually challenging, functional, fair, fun, consistent, realistic, and just generally good, here is proof I can actually be happy. Because it's finally time to talk about the standout feature with Grand Prix 4, the racing. Oftentimes we talk about feel in sim racing. Grand Prix 4's feel is utterly unmatched in my opinion. The thing is, as I mentioned before, that feel isn't in the steering wheel, it isn't in the physics, it's in what a race is. And Grand Prix 4 captures that essence of what a race is like no other racing sim. It starts in the menu by turning the AI up to the maximum ace difficulty and enabling player car failures, which in my opinion is a must. Because yes, your car will break down, you will blow engines randomly, the brakes will fail, transmissions will decide not to transmit, on and on and on and on and on. You will drive the wheels off of the thing, only for it to let you down at the worst moment. You will have zero control over this happening. That's motorsports. That's what a race is. Car failures also apply to the AI, of course, which you'll see engines going blammo in their stupendous early 2000s V10 fashion, and drivers hobbling around the track as they presumably work out an issue. It's not a mind-blowing feature itself. It's not something that is impossible to do today or isn't done today, but these are early 2000s F1 cars. So they hit that perfect sweet spot where they're simultaneously reliable enough where the idea of saving the car certainly doesn't apply, but unreliable enough where failures can and do happen, which will throw the wild card of unpredictability and unreliability into the race. It's the perfect environment for it, and it's such a key factor that I have to start there, let alone the fact that it's in the menu, so it's convenient to talk about now. Then you get out on track and you get a look at the AI itself and the behavior. You know, watching them interact with one another and the way the field spreads out as you'd expect, it just looks right. It feels right. You know, the biggest issue I've always had with AI is just the fact that they're really slow on the opening lap in the first corner, and they can easily be taken advantage of. But beyond that, they are as solid as any AI has been in any racing game since, and probably ever will be at this rate. You'll actually see the AI making an effort to defend position. You'll see them drive other cars down towards the grass in possible situations. You know, just like you'd see in the real world. They won't hesitate nearly as much as basically any other racing game to pass you, and occasionally they'll send it on the outside. Like, I almost never get passed in racing sims against the AI because the AI is just stupid in every racing game that isn't from Geoff Crammond or Papyrus, which sound like a broken record, I'm sorry. But in this game, no, you actually have to drive for position, because if you're slow, you're gonna get passed, which is kind of an important part of racing. In modern times, the AI being this willing to go for a gap is almost entirely related to turning the AI up to borderline implausibly reckless and suicidal levels. That's not the case here. They may still bump you here or there, But in my opinion, it's one of these things where it happens at a frequency level that it feels plausible and reasonable, because that's what happens in racing. Straight up, the most positive and straightforward endorsement I can give here is I don't use invulnerability when I race GP4's AI, because I never worry about the AI just deciding to be a brain-dead, stupid psycho or doing something that's implausibly, entirely inhuman and unbelievable out of nowhere. You know, even Monaco in the rain, I am never worried that the AI is just going to randomly poop its pants and screw me over for some reason. That's not to say pileups and wrecks don't happen, because they do. However, again, the difference is they happen at a frequency that it actually feels realistic rather than the AI is broken, which is a very large distinction to be made. You'll also find that the AI crashes occasionally with itself. It spins out on time to time, and occasionally it makes mistakes. It does look a little weird when it happens right in front of you, as the AI will look really scripted and obvious when it does, but overall, these are big pluses on the overall dynamics of a race. Speaking of scripting, that's the real magic here, because Grand Prix 4 is NASCAR's wet dream, as all the races are heavily scripted before the race even starts. Grand Prix 4 and other games of this series use a random seed to generate the race's events. So every race, the car crash and car failures are preordained from the get-go, as is the grid, the changing weather, the track drying, when that happens, when the AI makes mistakes, who runs what strategy, who wins and loses. It's all fake, and the only thing that changes is what you, the player, does. The magic, though, is if you didn't know about this, then you wouldn't know about this. And if you did know about it, it doesn't matter at all unless you want to run the same race over and over again because it was particularly exciting. Say the weather was very fun and exciting with the changeable track and all that stuff. Or if you're doing what used to be done in terms of creating an old school league before, well, when this game came out, because there was no online racing, as I talked about earlier on before. This was a way to essentially make sure that everybody was racing in the same conditions, in the same type of environment, and had the same scenario playing out in front of them. This is really very much a background system, but it is the secret sauce to the whole thing. You would say that surely this would enable the AI to feel very fake, or enable it to front-run weather changes with absolute pinpoint accuracy, but the system wasn't tuned this way. Similarly, I don't think I've ever had the thought of, I think I've seen this before, like you might expect with such a system. And really, when you put this together with the AI and the quality of the AI and just wheel-to-wheel and awareness and how it performs and engages with the player as well as other AI, you know, it's just one of those things that puts the pieces of the puzzle together, and it makes Grand Prix 4 feel like a game that is so far into the future from today, especially when you consider that so much of this experience traces itself back to the original F1 Grand Prix. Like, that game's 30 years old. It was 10 years old when Grand Prix 4 came out, and we still don't have anything even close. What are we doing? I'm sure some people are going to be saying I'm overstating how great GP4's AI is, but, you know, coming back to it after all these years, it's just like, this is so much better. Where did we go wrong? Where did sim racing go horribly wrong? Oh my god. I'm sorry. Moving on. The tracks, which, as you'd expect from an officially licensed game, it features all of the tracks from the 2001 Formula 1 calendar. However, these aren't just run-of-the-mill tracks. These were truly a revolution worth mentioning. All tracks in this game were made utilizing GPS data, which was a jump in quality similar to the move to laser scan tracks in more modern time. It's actually amazing the level of accuracy that they were able to achieve in 2002, and a testament to that is the fact that many of these tracks were later converted into R-Factor and even later platforms because they were that good. Signage around the track is more or less accurate to the real races, which just makes that experience so much better. It creates extra immersion. You know, several fan-made banners also appear around the track, which is a nice, wonderful addition. As well as there's no goofy immersion-breaking sim racing coach billboards tacked in here, or ads for latest sim racing products or this or that or the game that you're playing, which is really weird because they didn't exist, and instead, like, the video boards actually show you the race. Which, speaking of which, I'm going to get into a few little bonus things here that never sold a copy of this game but make a difference to the experience. You might understand, you might get it here. Those video boards can actually be set to a dynamic mode where they will actually show the race that you are racing in, but from the TV broadcast view like you'd see at the track. Not a fake pre-recorded clip on loop. It's not a billboard that plays a Grand Prix 4 ad. It's not doing the graphically much cheaper. We'll just put the player view on the Jumbotron because that's going to save a lot of like graphics power. It's showing the race from a whole different perspective as it happens on the video billboard. It's just crazy. It's really cool. It's also really expensive to run on your hardware in terms of performance, but it's just one of those things where it's like, that's neat. Someone cared enough to do that. You have the trackside marshals that get way ridiculously close to the track and would give anybody with a modern sensibility anxiety just seeing that there's this madman right on the very edge of the corner just waving the yellow flag like an absolute crazy person. It didn't make sense even back in 2001. It's a holdover from earlier years in the Grand Prix franchise, but it's a great way of communicating with a player that, hey, there's a yellow flag. You know, you definitely can't miss those guys because they're right on the side of the track. You know, it's ludicrous, it's ridiculous, but it's just cool. You'll also see them pushing broken cars around. You'll see an invisible crane that removes broken cars from the track and hoists them up into the sky. It's just, yes. Another really cool one you'll see in the rearview mirror when you're, exiting your pit garage, because you get to actually exit your pit garage. You'll see your guy in the rearview mirror. He jacks the car up. Presumably someone starts the car up. You can't really see that. It's 2002 graphics. All right, let's not get too carried away. But you'll see the guy in the rearview mirror jacking the car up, putting the car down. Your pit crew guy will wave you up. It's just one of those things where it's so neat. It's not a feature that sells the game, but it's a feature that sells the game to weirdos like myself, and I'm sure many of you guys. Similarly, when you come into the pits in a practice session or qualifying, the car will pull away from the pit garage, and then your pit crew guy, he'll come and push you back into the pit garage, and they'll jack the car up. A little TV thing will come down from the sky with the lap times and a video feed. It's just like, this is so cool. I'm sorry, I am fangirling super hard recording this video and this commentary. This isn't in the script, and I need to have a script because I got that ADHD brain. But it's equal parts. Grand Prix 4 is that great in this regard, and equal parts it really depresses me that sim racing has not topped a game from 20 years ago and the basic racing aspect, despite the fact that we keep trying to reinvent the tire, quite literally. It's just, it's a feel, okay? Alright, but returning things back to a somewhat semblant normal level here, the last thing I want to go ahead and touch on here in this video is modding, because that is a key portion of where Grand Prix 4 is and why you should play Grand Prix 4 even still to this day, if not because you watched a video where some guy raved like an absolute lunatic over how fun and exciting and engaging the racing experience is in this game that's 20 years old. So Grand Prix 4 wasn't a modding platform. It isn't a modding platform, but you wouldn't know it today. There were no mod tools released for Grand Prix 4. There was no track creation tools released for Grand Prix 4. The only reason modding happened in Grand Prix 4 is 100% due to the community's passion for this game. First of all, you got the no installation of Grand Prix 4 is complete feature of GPX patch. You have to install this in Grand Prix 4 because there's a bunch of fixes to the game that Grand Prix 4 probably would have gotten had the studio not been shut down so immediately after the release of Grand Prix 4 with the whole situation that was going on there. This also does fix, the issue of having all the cars have the same physics by removing power and grip from some of the slower teams on a per team basis. It gives you control over that random seed value, so that way you can run the same race over again if you want to do like one of those old school style offline league races. It gives you the accurate TV overlays and the ability to switch those out and swap them out and do some neat stuff like that. Almost from the get-go, the community has been creating different textures and cars pretty much from the get-go, adding in things like the requisite tobacco advertising and new cars and new car variants as they come out in the season. At times, almost more or less like real time, like freakishly quick after one of the races would happen where a major car update was unveiled, or like pretty substantially different wings or whatever. People in the community would make that specific version and it'd be like, oh yeah, this is the Hungaroring version of the car. And like you could download the Hungaroring version of the car, you could download the Imola version of the car, or this or that, and all these little different quirks and features that happen throughout an F1 season could be imported into your game. And literally, none of this was supported. None of this was supposed to happen. The only reason it happened was passion and a desire to make it happen. One thing on that front that I want to mention, again, more anecdotally here, is for the longest time, making tracks and new track layouts and variants and even tweaking tracks beyond just textures was considered impossible. It's not going to happen. We don't have the encryption, don't know how the tracks were built and how they were made and what everything does and how it all works. And the only way to do it would be to like reverse engineer everything. And it took years. And I absolutely dread to think how much time was spent to make the tools. But the community developed the tools to make track modding a thing within Grand Prix 4 because they wanted it that badly. It took a good 10 years after the initial launch of this game to make it into the modding platform that it is now, where you can download a season's worth of cars and install it with basically one click. You can do the same for tracks, and you can get into a game that, within the confines of the limitations of Grand Prix 4, you can start to play out those various seasons and various scenarios and do more with it than just have it limited to the 2001 season. Although, again, we've been doing this stuff since the very beginning somehow, because people just really wanted it that badly, and they took a whole heap of their own time to go ahead and make Grand Prix 4 the game that it is 20 years after it was the game that it is. If that makes any sense. You know what? On that topic of passion, I feel like that's an apt way to end this video that's been full of passion. So, anyways, let me know what you guys think about Grand Prix 4, and if I should go ahead and get the wheel working for Grand Prix 2 to do all that. But anyways, hope you guys enjoyed. Bye.